Hey everybody, some Gadget Guy here as we take a look at the camera on LG's newest flagship phone, the G4, moving up to a larger half-inch sensor and shooting UHD video. Starting off with some outdoor shots, we've been having slightly cloudier than usual weather here in LA, so the G4 will benefit from slightly softer light than I usually run my phones through on these tests. But flowers in direct sun expose well. On this white rose, we can still see that tendency towards overexposing as the petals clip. Reds and yellows are always problematic for digital sensors. While the G4 creates a bright scene that starts to lose detail on this poppy, it holds the shot together better than the 1/3 inch sensor on the G Flex 2 we recently reviewed on similar tests. When we see a predominantly red scene, I have to applaud LG's decision here to avoid oversaturating the shot. The G4 produces bright, pleasant video, but they aren't overly juicing the color to achieve it. Reds can sometimes be a mess, but the G4 produces one of the better examples of this test. If the phone has a color weakness, it might actually be with yellows, as with this little cluster of buds here. Again, not oversaturated per se, but slightly overexposed. Scaling back to some purples, and we're treated to a very pleasant scene. The overall look of the video is crisp, though I could do with slightly more contrast. I like a good contrasty shot, especially for how civilized the saturation is. While it's shooting UHD video, we're retaining a surprising amount of detail considering this video is only half the bitrate of the Lumia 930. We'll have a separate video comparing those two phones out soon. This is pretty fantastic compression, and I was very surprised to see that LG is producing a 30 megabit per second file here. Laser focus is a big selling point for LG, and I think it still sets the gold standard. It's a smooth, sliding action which rolls into a lock on your subject. There's very little over or under adjustment, as we've seen on some phones that have to scan the full focus range before locking on. LG has always felt very sure-footed here. I am a bit disappointed to see that the G4 still has an issue with macro shots, reporting it has locked focus when it obviously has not. Most problematic when you're too close to your subject. I wish this camera app was a bit more discerning, or would deliver a red focus square for images which are clearly not in focus anywhere near where I tapped. And I've griped about this before, but I wish I could pre-focus before shooting video and not have the app reset my focus. Every video you shoot will swap back to full-time autofocus. As mentioned, the G4 doesn't actually have the best macro close focus distance, but when you do lock it, the depth of field here is stunning. Backgrounds become watercolor, and the bokeh to my eye is ever so slightly softer and nicer than what I can achieve on the Lumia 930 and Galaxy S6. LG was not messing around here, and as I've commented on every LG camera after the G2, the only major improvement they could make was stepping up to a larger sensor. Now we see the fruits of that size increase. The zoom test isn't terrible. There's enough resolution for a subtle pixel resample, and after that, blowing up the image maintains a respectable level of quality, while avoiding the trap of over-sharpening the image. Crop zoom in UHD will continue being lame until we can at least double the resolution we currently have, but LG showing here is better than most. Into our walking test, we can clearly see how much more compensation LG has worked into their hardware stabilization, very much resembling the wobble we see on Lumia cameras. It does run into a problem readjusting at the apex of alternating footfalls, but very few phones tackle this well. It's usually software stabilization that plays better. But throughout all the videos here, the G4 does an excellent job of compensating for my shaky hands. Into our traffic test, the camera does a great job of displaying movement throughout the scene. We also see better dynamic range than on previous LG cameras. Only the brightest spots on white cars here are starting to clip. Greens look good, the sky looks good. While I respect the decision to avoid oversaturation, I again wish we had just a little more contrast here. This is repeated in our freeway test. Very natural color, great dynamic range, but I prefer just a touch more contrast. Audio doesn't seem to be much, if any, improved over the G Flex 2. We hear about the same level of nearly destructive noise reduction, but it's thankfully evolved out of that terrible warbling effect we used to get on phones like the G2. On our transition test, moving from dark to bright and back, the bloom here is softer and more subtle than on the G Flex 2, which is already a solid performer. It's a pleasant transition moving from dark to bright, though it still doesn't quite beat the Galaxy S6 when moving from bright back to dark, as there's just a bit more shimmer or buzz as the shutter speed slows down. Still, one of the best phones we've run through this test. Just a couple quick examples of slow-mo from this camera. The iPhone still sets the standard for 720p slow motion video, but LG's offering is nicely improved, retaining more info and less pixelation. It's a fun setting to play with. Videos play in real time at 120 frames per second, so you'll have to run them through some kind of software to slow them down, but that means it'll retain the audio. Now for some night shots, LG is still working a little harder at overexposing than I would prefer. Thankfully, the combo of larger sensor and huge aperture means we don't have to crank the ISO as high for that overexposure, and noise throughout our night shots is fairly tame. The autofocus can get a bit confused, especially when objects pass immediately in front of the lens, but we're treated to some overall great shots when lit just by street lamps. I'm not sure what this effect is called when using a super wide aperture, distorting the street light here. Someone please leave me a comment on that. But otherwise, Creepy Tunnel is very well rendered. Not so creepy when it's this bright. But again, thankfully this brightness didn't come at the expense of super big, blocky, ugly noise. Pause the video for just a sec and you can make out a lot of detail in the dirt just above the tunnel. Creepy Gate is one of the few times I haven't loved the white balance on the G4. The scene is lit by a really ugly yellow security light, and while the G4 did an excellent job of finding a truer white, my personal preference leans towards retaining the actual color of a scene. On our walkway, we can clearly see the color temperature difference between these two bulbs, which drives my OCD crazy. And again, that push towards overexposing means we start to lose the actual structure of the light housing closest to the camera. And a flower directly under a porch light, it's shocking to see how well this is exposed. Very good color, very little blurring of detail, and a noise profile which does not look like ants are crawling all over the shot. Very well done. One final note about the G4 camera, I was disappointed to find that LG's manual mode does not seem to influence video. Settings like exposure do not change the brightness of video. Setting the camera 2 stops darker resulted in this shot, but the video looks the same as when we set the camera 2 stops brighter. Those settings are a godsend for shooting stills, and RAW support is very welcome for editing these shots. LG should absolutely be commended here for providing the simplest interface, an excellent auto mode, and one of the most comprehensive manual modes found on any phone. Though I can't help but be a touch disappointed that video doesn't benefit from that last option. So where's that leave us with the camera on the G4? Damn, LG, way to step it up there, buddy. This is exactly the kind of hardware improvement I've been asking for since the launch of the G3. Larger sensors are better. With LG joining the half-inch club, we have yet another incredible option for phone photogs, as this flagship joins the ranks of Samsung and Lumia gear. Great dynamic range, even-handed color and white balance, fantastic depth of field. When shooting video due to the lack of any control over exposure, the G4 is a very close third behind Microsoft and Samsung. But often its auto mode is good enough to compete against phones we've praised in the past. For people focused on shooting stills, this is now the camera to beat. No joke. It's wonderfully easy to get vibrant, photographic stills out of this shooter. Simply wonderful performance with plenty of customization options to provide the user exactly the experience they might want at any skill level. Congratulations, LG, and welcome to the premier phone photography club. I'll of course leave some links below this video for more info on the G4 and where you can shop this puppy online. As always, folks, thanks so much for watching. Be sure to hit subscribe for more reviews like these, and I would not be able to continue producing on this channel if you all weren't out there sharing my videos on social sites like Reddit and Facebook and Twitter and the Googles Plus. So please keep bringing more cool people to the party. Hit that thumbs up button, and I will catch you all on the next review.